Aloha class, I'm Flavio Marroquin, and today I will be doing a weekly presentation on human rights in American foreign policy from the writings of Jack Donelly and Daniel Whelan. A brief summary of the readings includes going over the Cold War, back and forth with human rights, American exceptionalism, human rights case study, the strengths and weaknesses of the writing, and finishing up with some questions. Before we get to American exceptionalism, which is the author's main point, it is important to understand the history of the U.S. stance on human rights. After World War II, a shift in human rights enthusiasm changed globally. Human rights concerns were no longer the priority and was seen as subordinate to strategic and ideological rivalry with the Soviet Union. The focus was mitigating the spread of communism. This led to the US viewing themselves as the leader of the free world, which promoted coups in Guatemala, Iran, and Chile to spread democracy and to avoid future communist rule, especially in the Western Hemisphere. It wasn't until the 1970s when they were able to incorporate human rights policies into US foreign policy. The Cold War tensions did not help because President Ford had signed a provision that denied special trade preferences to non market economies that restricted some human rights policies, especially with immigration. It wasn't until a few years after, in Jimmy Carter's presidency, that the US started to focus on incorporating human rights into US foreign policy. Some of the contributing factors included the long lasting agenda with the Cold War and the Vietnam War. The Watergate scandal also played a contributing factor as US citizens were feeling betrayed by the lawlessness going on with the scandal. It renewed the commitment to focus on something else, which was human rights. These efforts took a step back at the end of the 1970s, starting with the Iranian Revolution, Nicaraguan Revolution, and the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, which would ultimately put human rights as not a priority for the US. By 1981, President Reagan's administration took a more confrontational stance against communism. However, his administration did not completely do away with previous efforts, as they advocated in the UN that support for anti communism was support to human rights, since the biggest threat to human rights was communism itself. Instead, they advocated for democracy and free elections, especially for those pro American governments. By Reagan's second presidential term, it softened. The U.S. stance again by focusing in the Central American region. A bipartisan group in Congress refused to sacrifice international human rights to ideological and geopolitical struggles against communism. The group helped the U.S. government sign the Torture Convention and the Genocide Convention, which had a 40-year wait time for it to be recognized by the U.S. This helped propel human rights foreign policy to have new opportunities which were seen in Bill Clinton's administration. By 1991, the fall of the Soviet Union occurred, which helped Bill Clinton's administration to reinforce or refocus on human rights. When President Clinton took office, his initiatives was to spread democracy, promote human rights, and reinvigorate relations with the UN. In 1993, they actively lobbied for human rights in the World Conference on Human Rights, and in 1995, they lobbied for women's rights initiatives. Clinton's administration started off strong towards human rights, but by the second term, it shifted back again by not signing the Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights agreements. And some of the covenants that they did agree to were with asterisk by not being applicable to American law. By the Bush administration, human rights took a step back again due to terrorist attacks of September 11th. Terrorism trumped human rights again, or for the first time. Even in modern human rights foreign policy, the US tends to attack perceived enemies by putting them on the spot for human rights violations building while ignoring the building relations with other countries. I would say it's kind of hypocritical of the US. As you can see, the US bounced back and forth with human rights policies over several decades. Now let's focus on American exceptionalism. Jack Donnelly and Daniel Whelan put it best. American exceptionalism can be examined as a guiding thread for understanding human rights policies and practices for the U.S. Simply put, the U.S. throughout the decades fluctuated their foreign policy stance on human rights, which had always handled human rights its own way. It didn't rely on an international organization to implement their own version of it. American exceptionalism is the belief that the US is different, superior, according to the authors, when compared to other countries because the US's domestic commitment to human rights already existed. The authors also pointed out that even the founding father George Washington stressed to not be an active participant for freedom overseas, which ties to American isolationism. In contrast, American intervention has also played a key role in elections by promoting democracy and human rights. Donelly and Whelan also discussed exemptionalism, where, for example, other countries must follow human rights policies, and it is for them and not for us, US mentality, because there is a structure set forth in the US already and are exempted from additional policies. It's a position the US feel that they invented human rights. It played a role, especially during the War on Terror and invasion of Iraq, where terrorists were denied basic human rights and sent to places like the controversial Guantanamo Bay. This stressed again that human rights policies were only for them. Now, let's discuss some human rights case studies mentioned in the reading. There are several case studies mentioned. The main ones I will go over are Nicaragua and El Salvador. During the Carter administration, the U.S. provided foreign aid to many Central American countries. There came a point in 1978 that the U.S. noticed the Nicaraguan government was corrupted, and the U.S. government chose not to support Nicaragua with foreign military aid and sanctioning Nicaragua. The Nicaraguan elected leader, Anastasio Somoza Debayle, refused to negotiate with the U.S. by not stepping down after being accused of corruption and winning by a corrupted election system. His regime was also accused of human rights violations against the indigenous people. The effects of the sanctions on Nicaragua were more detrimental to the citizens of Nicaragua as it neglected help from the U.S. That is until the revolution finished, which actually became costly for the U.S. By the time a new regime took over and the U.S. was willing to provide assistance, it had spent over $118 million, which was more than any other Central American country at the time receiving aid from the U.S. In El Salvador, the U.S. pushed their agenda towards supporting them, even though their government did nothing but violate political and social rights of their citizens. A clear showing of lack of progress was evident in El Salvador. According to Donelly and Whelan, the Carter administration failed to identify the most dangerous threats to human rights, which was not authoritarian dictatorship, but by totalitarian dictatorship. Now, to discuss some of the strengths and weaknesses of the authors, which include the following. For strengths, the argument that is backed up by the authors are the fact that the U.S. was for human rights, but only when it was beneficial for them and their U.S. hegemony. Saying human rights is for them and not for us is crucial to understand this argument. It is a brutal truth. Additionally, through the Cold War, the author points out that the tensions between the U.S. and the communist countries was by far evident and took precedence before any human rights issue. The U.S. only got involved when it was beneficial for them. As for weaknesses, I feel like the authors failed to emphasize how much of the human rights violation fall on the respective country. They are biased towards mentioning how much of their policies are self-induced, and the U.S. does try to help with their own best interest in mind. The authors seem to focus on the negative aspects only, even though the U.S. assistance assisted them when it was necessary and didn't have to because the U.S. hegemony was already in place. Additionally, When it comes to more recent U.S. presidents, they failed to incorporate U.S. decisions on immigration policies in the best interest of national defense, which is often disregarded by individuals who place national security in a lower priority. And now to wrap things up with a few questions. Does the US have credibility on advocating for human rights, even though history has shown that they have been biased towards end states of human rights situations, especially when it has played in their favor? Question two, in today's climate, when it comes to human rights, could the current war between Ukraine and Russia set back previous efforts to the Cold War and put human rights in the back burner as shown in past history? Thank you.